Hi everyone, and welcome back to Bastion Entertainment. In our last video we created a top-down 4-directional sprite using GameMaker Studio and made it walk around. Today we're going to add some assets to our room and give him something to walk around on. We're also going to play around with some filter effects and try to add a drop shadow to our character. The first thing we'll need to do is open a new sprite. Any asset that you have to experiment with will do. I created an asset in Krita ahead of time for this project. We're just going to call this SPR Stone Steps 2. Make sure you're on your instances layer and drag this into your room. GameMaker Studio includes these filters and effects. They're going to be in your room editor underneath filters and effects. We're going to play with this hard drop shadow. I wanted to give my drop shadow kind of a blue color to go with the game's color palette, which is kind of like a bluish gray. Before we run our game, let's adjust our viewports and camera settings. If you go to your room inspector and scroll down, you'll find a tab that is titled Viewports and Cameras. Underneath that, make sure that you enable viewports and enable your clear viewport background. And under viewport 0, you want to click Visible. And I've set our camera properties to 900 by 540 pixels, and I've done our viewport properties to 900 and 540 pixels as well. For object following, make sure you have your obj_spr_player selected as the sprite that your camera follows. And for horizontal border, I set it to 32, and I set the vertical border to 32 as well, because we want the camera to follow our sprite pretty closely. So you can see that our camera settings are enabled, and we can see our little drop shadow underneath the character. It's nice that GameMaker offers these filters and effects, and as we play with some more of them, I'm sure we'll find some that we can use, but this drop shadow is not my favorite, so we're going to go ahead and create our own. We're going to use the sprite editor to create a simple drop shadow, and then we're going to use some GML to add it to our character. Make sure you call your drop shadow or whatever you create in your sprite editor SPR_player_shadow. And in your asset browser, go ahead and select your object sprite player. And we're going to add some lines of code that will create the drop shadow. Open up your create event. Now, if you haven't watched the last video, lines 1 through 4 is what we use to set up our create event to enable our top-down character's movement. Today we'll be adding to the create event so that our drop shadow can move around with the character, and we'll be creating a draw event. First off, let's take a look at these additional lines in our create event and see what they're doing. This code initializes a variable player sprite to -1 in the create event, providing a default value. Later it sets the variable to the actual sprite index of the object sprite index, effectively linking the object to its sprite. In this next step, you'll need to add a draw event to your object SPR player. And what this code does is it draws a shadow sprite, SPR player shadow, beneath the player character, adjusting its position based on offsets. If a valid player sprite exists, it draws the shadow first, and then the player character sprite. Alright, once you've added your draw event to your object, you can go ahead and run your game. Now, technically, it's doing what we've asked it to do, but our shadow's in the wrong position, and I ended up making my shadow a little bit bigger to fit the character. So let's go back into GameMaker and see what the problem might be. Alright, it turns out that it's a simple solution. Where it says shadow offset, you're going to want to adjust those X and Y values. You might have to play around with these numbers until you get it just right. So once you're done troubleshooting, go ahead and run your game, and you should see something like this. I had never played around with particle systems in GameMaker, so I wanted to add a particle system to this room and just kind of see what it did. I was kind of thinking I could just add like some fog or some blue smoke to the room. As you can see, there's lots of different particle objects and shapes that you can choose from. We're just going to go with this little cloud. I don't want to cover up our assets too much, so I'm going to drag it off to the side. Alright, once you've found a good location for your particle system, go ahead and run your game and let's see what it looks like. Give this video a like if you found it helpful, and go ahead and subscribe for more game creation in GameMaker Studio.